Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dennis, and many thanks to the First Saturday's PDX group for this opportunity to speak with you today about, as you've heard several times, artistic exchange between China and Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm sure all of us say this hundreds of times a day, but I do wish that we could be in person and that I could be looking at your faces as we talk about this material, that this is at least a nice way to be able to get together and exchange information. So artistic exchange between China and Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries is a pretty broad topic. And in truth, I'm not going to be speaking very much about European art in China, so much as I'm going to be talking about Chinese art in Europe, and specifically, as Dennis mentioned, the Netherlands, a country that many Americans refer to as Holland, which would be a little bit like calling the United States New York or California, since Holland is the largest province in the Netherlands. And to further refine the scope of my subject, I'm going to be speaking about art produced primarily in the 17th century. So originally I had a larger scope in mind, but I'm going to narrow it down to just the 17th century. I'd be happy, though, in questions to talk more about the 18th century and transformations that I think are happening in that period. When I was in graduate school, my advisor often suggested that I articulate the stakes of my research. Dawn, what are the stakes of this question? She would often ask me. And so I'd like to begin this talk by thinking about the stakes. In other words, why is this subject important? Why do we need to know what the Dutch thought about China and Chinese art in the 17th century? So to begin to answer that question, I'd like to jump forward in time a little bit. And I'm showing on the screen a painting by the 19th century American Impressionist artist, Mary Cassatt. Cassatt, who lived much of her adult life in Paris, was part of the same artistic circles as painters like Edgar Degas and Manet. And like Degas, Cassatt was very much influenced by Japanese art, especially by Japanese woodblock prints. When I'm teaching the Introduction to European Art class here at Lewis and Clark, which I do infrequently, but I've done it quite a bit actually recently. When we get to the 19th century, that's usually the period in which we want to think about Japonism. And in the textbook, Degas becomes the focus for that, for thinking about how Japanese art influenced European art. He did himself have a large collection of Japanese prints, and so there's good reason to do that. But when I come to that part of the textbook, I always focus on Mary Cassatt. And one of the reasons for that is that I think that of all the Impressionists, she was actually the most technologically innovative in her efforts to respond to Japanese printmaking. Because what we're looking at here is her intaglio print. So she's working on metal, not on wood. And it's a very different process. You're taking out what you want to print black rather than leaving it standing. So I really think that she's a better focus for thinking about how extremely influential Japanese art was in 19th century Paris. And I also like, whenever I can, to be able to speak about women artists. So as I'm sure many of you know, after visiting a large exhibition of Japanese woodblock prints in Paris in 1890, Cassatt produced a set of 10 color etchings, we're looking at one of them here on the right, that were, as I said, an open imitation of the Japanese woodblock's subjects, compositions, and technical innovations. And here's just another example in which we can see Cassatt responding to Utamo's subject matter, the typical, so I'm calling this typical for East Asian woodblocks in general, view of looking from an elevated position down into the scene, the female subject seemingly unaware of the viewer's presence, the use of mirrors to complicate the composition and to give us access to the female figure's faces, and also the mostly blank background, which helps to create a compressed space and allows us to focus on line and textile patterns as they create form. Jumping ahead in time, I show even further in time, I show on the screen a painting by the artist Mark Tobey. So for those of us who are from the Northwest, we kind of claim Tobey as our own. He's considered to be one of this generation of Northwest painters. And what we're looking at here is his white writing style, where white or light colored calligraphy brushstrokes are painted over a field of muted color. Maybe if I show you a detail, you get a better sense of that, which is itself made up of small interwoven brushstrokes. As a critic wrote at the time that Tobey first displayed this painting in a gallery in New York, and I'm quoting the critic here, Tobey's method is a fusion of the spirit of Chinese writing with morphic characters rooted in 20th century European painting. And it derives from Tobey's intensely personalized vision. Like Cassatt, Toby studied Japanese woodblock prints, as well as Chinese ink painting, calligraphy, and Zen painting traditions. And again, like Cassatt, we can see the ways that Toby's appreciation for East Asian art influenced not only the content, but also the form of his work. This single comparison will have to stand in for many that I could have made. And what I'm trying to do is to explain how an ancient and revered work of art on the left, Chinese art on the left, and Toby's response to it on the right, so that we can see how Toby is emulating Muqi's brushwork as it moves between pure abstraction and representation. What I mean is that there's a kind of fine line between a mark on the surface of paper seeming to be only a random brush mark, and then it cohering into a bird's wing or a duck's foot. So it's really playing with that move between abstraction and the coherence of form that I think Toby is finding inspirational in East Asian art, and especially in this example. So just a detail here to give you a sense of that movement between brushwork, the abstraction of the potential abstraction of brushwork, and then the coherence of form. Although this work of white writing dates to 1959, Toby's first white paintings were actually created much earlier, in 1935. And they may have been the inspiration for paintings like abstract expressionists such as Jackson Pollock, who I show here in this canonical photograph from life, flinging paint onto the canvas, dripping paint onto the canvas to create these works that are much larger than Toby's. So I just want to be clear, Toby's actually tend to be quite intimate works. Sometimes they're very personal. They were meant to be gifts to fellow artists, whereas Pollock is really aiming to kind of envelop the viewer in this experience. But he seems to have been influenced by the abstraction that he saw in artists like Toby. So I'm beginning this talk by looking at Cassatt's and Toby's work because I want to remind this group that these artists who were so instrumental in pushing European art toward modernism were also deeply embedded to East Asian art making practices. In other words, and I know this is going to sound really reductive and I'd be happy to have it pulled apart in questions, East Asian art was in a sense modern before modernity. And it helped European and American artists think about the representational possibilities of abstraction, ways that you can deny illusionism and avoid three-dimensional spaces, instead amplifying and emphasizing the two-dimensional surface, and the ways that brushwork can reveal subjective experiences, internal states of mind on the part of the artist. So in a sense, I believe that Cassatt and Toby were not aiming to represent Asia in their work, but they're looking to Asian art in order to view their own domestic environments and art practices through a different lens. And I don't want to claim that this is necessarily good. I mean, I still think that there are issues of appropriation that we want to think about even in these kinds of works. But I want to set the stage for thinking about how this might be different from what we're going to encounter in the 17th century. So in the 17th century, when Europeans and East Asians first begin to make sustained contact with one another, I do think that East Asian art pushes forward a rethinking on the part of European artists. But my question is whether this is the same kind of new lens that I'm proposing for Cassatt and Toby, or is it something else? And if Europeans are in this earlier period seeing differently, what does this tell us? And if Europeans are in this earlier period resistant to seeing differently, so 17th century artists aren't willing to kind of look at their own domestic spaces through an Asian lens, what does this tell us about the qualities Europeans value in their own domestic products and those that they consume from cultures beyond their borders? So as I'm sure most people in the audience know, Europe had been in touch, we could say, with Asia from at least the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. There's evidence that Han Dynasty Chinese silk and other objects there's evidence that these Chinese silks and other objects appear in Roman households. And in a later period, in the 13th century, we also have the travels of Marco Polo and other Italian merchants across the so-called Silk Road. But by the 17th century, the contact was far more sustained and intimate. And I'm going to propose that there are two main ways that Europeans came to know about East Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries. The first is missionary activity, and the second is commerce or global trade. And I'm not being innovative in naming these two ways of thinking about cross-cultural exchange in this period. I'm just trying to use them as a way to organize the talk. So I'm showing here a title page illustration to a book that was written by Athanasius Kircher. Kircher was a German Jesuit priest who lived in Rome. He never traveled himself outside of Europe, but he became a repository for letters and objects and other kinds of information that his brothers who were in missions around the world would send back to Rome. And what Kircher is picturing here is one of the most famous Jesuits in the history of missionary work in China, and that's Matteo Ricci on the left. And then on the right, a Chinese convert to Catholicism who took the baptismal name of Paul. Ricci moved to China in 1582. He's the first documented European to, I mean, others may have gone earlier, but we really have documentation that he entered the Chinese capital city in 1601, and he died there 9 years later. In his almost 20 years residing in China, Ricci became fluent in Mandarin, and most impressive, was extremely gifted in writing and reading Chinese. I don't have to tell this audience that Chinese is a character-based rather than an alphabetic language, and particularly if you learn it as an adult, it requires a prodigious memory to absorb all of those characters. That's even more true when we're thinking about Ricci, because what was typical of the Jesuit missionary work in China is that the idea that they were going to convert from the top down. So ultimately, they would have loved to convert the emperor. They were never successful in that, but they definitely wanted to convert the elites and then to have that trickle down to the common people. And they understood that in order to do that, they themselves needed to be able to speak elite language, which meant that you needed to have a deep knowledge of the texts that were seen as foundational to Chinese culture. There's a really wonderful, it's an old book now, but a really wonderful book by Jonathan Spence called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci, which helps to explain the techniques, they were visual techniques, that Ricci used both in his own Catholic, his own Christian practice in Europe, but also then when he needed to be able to learn Chinese as an adult. So Ricci's facility with language was important because translation of Christian texts into Chinese was central to the Jesuits, again, because they're aiming to engage with the part of Chinese culture that's highly literate. An example of this kind of translation of Christian text into Chinese is the missionary Giulio Aleni's translation of a book by Jerome Nadal. So Aleni's work is obviously on the right and Nadal's on the left. Nadal's work, which is Netherlandish, it was printed in Antwerp, tells the life of Jesus in a combination of text and image. And in this comparison, we can see that both Nadal and Aleni are depicting the visitation. That's the scene when Jesus's mother, the Virgin Mary, who's pregnant with Jesus, visits her relative Elizabeth, who's also pregnant with John the Baptist. And this kind of like in utero meeting is the first example of John the Baptist realizing that that there's someone greater than he, and that Jesus will be the true Messiah and John will be the precursor to him. Aleni's translation of Nadal's text appears to be as exact as possible, a recapitulation of the original. From the use of closely spaced parallel lines, I'm thinking of here, which is aiming, I think, to suggest the kind of darkening that we see in Nadal's work, and so to give a sense of three-dimensionality as you move down into the shadows from one step to another. He's also using one-point linear perspective to create the illusion of three-dimensional spaces, especially as we move into the background here. You can see that he's using a grid to help do that. And most importantly, we can see that the image is tied with the text at the bottom of the page, as in the Nadal original. So individual figures are marked with characters, you can see here and here, or letters in the Nadal original, that break the illusionism of the page in order to link the figure here with the text below. In contrast, Juan Derosa's earlier translation of Nadal's text, so I'm showing his version of the Visitation now on the right, does not seem intended to copy or match Nadal's original. Instead, it wants to translate it into a Chinese visual language. reinterpreting a house through Chinese norms of domestic architecture, and applying Chinese woodblock print conventions of picturing space through, as we've mentioned already, this bird's eye view down into the scene, pushing the background up the picture plane rather than creating cavities of space that extend beyond it, and employing in general an emphasis on line over shadow and an emphasis on two over three-dimensional form. So here, for example, we don't see the kinds of attempts to create cross-hatching that would give us the shadows that pull a form into 3 dimensions, at least for European eyes. A comparison, so now I'm moving Derosa onto the left, a comparison of another Derosa print, this one of the Annunciation. So this is when the angel Gabriel here on the left is coming to the Virgin Mary to tell her that even though she's a virgin, she's going to bear a child, and that child will be the Son of God and also the embodiment of God. And I'm comparing it with an illustration from a popular Chinese novel, The Plum and the Golden Vase, to show how much the Derosa print shares the formal qualities of popular Chinese fiction. So again, the bird's eye view down into the scene, a focus on line to define form, and a domestic interior space that's very similar. The two spaces are very similar between the two in terms of using balustrades, lattice panels, and figures backed by paintings. So what I mean to point out here is that you might think at first glance that the Virgin Mary is kneeling in front of a window that lets us look out into a landscape. But actually, this is a standing screen panel that has a landscape painted on it. And as many of you will know, landscape paintings are often employed in this way. Standing screen landscape paintings are often employed in this way. So within the interior of the house, they would help to divide one space from another. But in pictures of the interior of houses, they're often used to reflect back on the figure in front of them. So a landscape such as this, as I hope I'm going to show in this talk, would have associations of elite scholarly communities. And that's the kind of association that's being reflected back onto the Virgin Mary. In the illustration on the right, it's not a standing screen, it's a hanging scroll, and it's a depiction of a deity who is hanging on a wall behind a table. I will say that the actual content of these two images, so the form is very similar. The content couldn't be more different. This is a super spiritual, right, highly charged moment, theological moment for Christians. And this, on the other hand, is a depiction of a woman raising the skirt of a young widow to show her bound foot to the anti-hero. In some ways, I think that this deity is kind of maybe looking on at chagrin at the events unfolding in front of him. As many will know, to show your bound foot to anyone beyond your husband or close family members would have been a kind of shocking thing to do. The Eleni and Derosa images represent then two avenues for translating a set of Netherlandish engravings into forms that would be legible to Chinese viewers. So again, what I'm proposing is that Derosa interprets the Nadal print through the conventions of Chinese illustrated fiction, popular novels, while Eleni translates Nadal's text into Chinese, but allows the woodblock print image to remain obviously foreign in its use of one-point linear perspective and other conventions of European picturing. I could say much more about the Jesuit belief in the efficacy of imagery as a tool of conversion, of the ways they imagine using it as an instrument of education, as a way that images are spaces for their own meditative practices, and also of the ways that they speak about pictures as being central to their conversion efforts. What's important here in this cross-cultural dialogue is the Jesuit, and more generally, I'd say the European belief in the power of European pictorial style to astonish non-European viewers with its realism, which was seen to be so distinctly from, and in European eyes, so superior to Chinese conventions of representation. So what I want to think about here, what I hope these images are showing, is that although I think Derosa's image is more innovative in the ways that it's trying to translate Christian subject matter, again, into a visual language the Chinese could read legibly, what was more common was to take the approach of a Lenny and to try to keep the conventions of European pictures at work, because Europeans thought these pictures would be so powerful in their realistic effect that any potential convert would be sort of instantly transformed into a Christian. And there are actually texts where they describe this happening. They saw this painting of the Virgin Mary and immediately believed. It's also tied, I think, to a sense that European realism, so again, using shadow, one-point linear perspective, is also a sign of cultural superiority. So when the Jesuits and other visitors to China write about Chinese painting, this isn't true for how they write about Chinese ceramic, or how they write about Chinese architecture, or how they write about Chinese lacquer. But when they write about Chinese painting, particularly ink painting on silk or paper, they tend to talk about it as being lifeless and dead, almost scary in its inability to somehow be legible to European eyes. Whereas European art is seen as being lifelike, mimetic, realistic, and therefore powerful. So already I'm trying to set up then the ways that Europeans seem to not be able to kind of allow themselves access to Chinese painting. What I've tried to convey thus far is that European missionaries in China were unusually learned, sophisticated, fluent in Mandarin and other spoken languages, and very familiar with Chinese textural and pictorial norms. Because their knowledge of China was deep, many, like Ricci, spent the majority of their adult lives in the country. These missionaries became a primary means of transferring information about China back to Europe, not only in private letters, but also in having their information circulate in the form of printed books. And I'm going to try to say more about that in a moment. But first, I want to transition a bit and talk about this second means of transferring information, trade. I show here a street in Amsterdam that's viewed across one of its major canals, and I do this in order to remind you that the Netherlands is a water-soaked region. So what I'm showing here, what I'm aiming to show, is the way that water inundates the land and is literally held back by human-made fortifications. One example of this is this seawall, where you can see that this built wall is actually holding back the sea, which is at a higher level than the land on the other side of it. It's I think I have these statistics right, something like a quarter of the Dutch land is below sea level. And maybe as much as a half of it can be seen as reclaimed from the sea during this long process that began in 1300 and continues today. So the idea is that you build dikes or seawalls that are going to prevent the sea from moving into the land, pump the water out of the land, and then use that land for that irrigated land for planting or other kinds of uses. And what I want to suggest is that this means that the Dutch begin to conceive of their land as something that they created. So the phrase that's used in the 17th century is, God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. And so I think that that sets up a different relationship to landscape than the one that I'm going to be talking about when we're thinking about the long tradition of Chinese landscape. In the Dutch 17th century, this genre of landscape painting. So what we think, if I say to my spouse, oh, I really need think we need a landscape there hanging on the wall of our house. That whole idea of landscape is something that's created in the Netherlands in the 17th century. It exists in Chinese art almost 700 years earlier, from the 9th and 10th centuries. But in Europe, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, the idea that you would focus only on landscape in an image. And again, one of the things the Dutch are thinking about is to use these reality effects to make the viewer think that what they see is what the landscape actually looks like. But in fact, they're using this landscape, both the land itself and the representation of it, as a metaphor for this growing Dutch nation state. So you might look at this and think, oh, that's what Bentham Castle looks like. But if you compare it with a photograph of the castle, you can see the ways that Ruysdael has actually transformed the land to make the castle seem as if it's more elevated and more majestic, and to convince the viewer that that's the way it really appears. In contrast, I guess I would say, to the Dutch emphasis on landscape in their own home territory, as colonists, they're less interested in acquiring or colonizing or taking over vast tracts of land than they are in selecting to colonize parts of the world that will give them important trading ports. So this isn't to say by any means that the Dutch aren't engaged in brutal and inhumane practices in the 17th century in building these colonies, and that they're not interested in extracting as much as they can of the consumable goods of these regions. But they are primarily interested in facilitating trade and getting things moving between these spaces. And so you can see that they're really building their colonies at the edges of these different land masses so that they have port cities that will facilitate their trade. So on the one hand, the Dutch know how to manage water in terms of building their own land. On the other hand, they know how to manage water as sailors. And so although in the map of Europe, the United Provinces, which we see here of the Netherlands, is relatively small geographically, they had an outsized role to play in 17th century trade because they knew how to get things from one place to another through ships. So in terms of trade with China, the Dutch focused on, and this is sort of in order of importance, importing spices, tea, and textiles from China, but ceramics, especially porcelain, were also imported in large quantities. It's an oft-quoted statistic that something like 300 million pieces of Chinese porcelain were exported from China in the 17th century. And of that, 5%, 3 million, ended up in the Netherlands. It's still true, I think, that when Dutch archaeologists are doing digs in the Netherlands, or even when builders are excavating for a foundation, they come across these huge piles of potsherds, many of which contain Chinese porcelain. So I really want us to think about the culture as being sort of super saturated with material from China. So in this case of this 17th century bowl, it's decorated on one side with an image of 3 men in a pleasure boat attended by servants, and on the other side by a poem, with a poem by Saussure, an 11th century scholar who's describing his visit with friends to the Red Cliffs. The Red Cliffs is the site of a very famous 3rd century battle, and the delights of drinking wine, eating fresh food, and contemplating mortality with intimate friends. So they're thinking about the heroes of these battles, the residue of their names, the possibility of immortality. Saussure was an enormously influential historical and literary figure, and his recounting of this experience and his meditation on death, history, and immortality was widely circulated and traditionally would have been represented in the format of a hand or hanging scroll. This is a hand scroll, obviously, like this one, which is painted in black ink on paper. And I just want you to note the length of this hand scroll. So it's the equivalent of 4.5 feet. And so and remind you that the way that I'm showing it here and the way that you might see it in a museum under a vitrine is really the antithesis of how a viewer is meant to engage with a hand scroll. So remembering that we want to think about unrolling a hand scroll the width of our shoulders and looking at a section and then rolling it back up again and taking out another section. So it's an iterative, sequential process of viewing that it unfolds literally or unrolls literally over time. And it's also a very intimate viewing experience because you can't have more than 1 or maybe 2 people look at a hand scroll at the same time. So when we see them unfurled this way in front of us, that again is totally the opposite of how we want to imagine engaging with it at the time it might have been created. But instead, so this image of this poem about the Red Cliffs, when it's translated to porcelain, the image and the text are located on an object that has to be turned in the hand or walked around to be viewed in its entirety. And so that sense of movement and time that is originally captured in the artist's hand laying down ink, and then in our hands unrolling the hand scroll as we move through it, has been replaced by an object, the bowl, that is actually, that to have it made has to go through several hands. Let me just restate that in a slightly more concrete way. So in other words, what I'm thinking about with the calligraphy is to remind you that the calligraphers are trained to think about sequences of writing characters. So maybe I could think about my own sons who went to a Mandarin immersion elementary school here in Portland, which we're so grateful for. And they, like me, when I was learning Chinese as an adult, were given these pads of paper with little boxes, and there would be dotted lines of the stroke order for the characters. So what stroke do you make first? What stroke do you make second? And so all viewers and writers of Chinese will be able to kind of retrace in their minds the order and that lays down the ink on the paper. So again, there's a kind of component of time. The viewer can not just read the text, not just view the text for the content, that what the text is saying, but to think of it as an image itself, and one that we can kind of remake as we look at this work of calligraphy and retrace it in our minds. And again, what I want to say is how different this is then from the process of making a porcelain bowl, because there are so many different hands at work here. So first you have the person who pots the bowl, right, molds it or throws it on a wheel. Then you have the bisque firing. Then you have the person who writes the characters or paints the landscape, and that probably would have been two at least different people in cobalt on the surface of the bisque fired bowl. Then you have it glazed, then you have it put back into the kiln. So this is all going through many hands, and that sense of like instantaneity of being able to relive the making of a piece of calligraphy with an artist now has been almost calcified or frozen on the surface of this bowl. And I think we can see a similar dissonance caused by competing senses of individual time versus the long-term, many-handed process of ceramic production in this brush pot dated to 1667. Here the inscription reads, "Meandering white clouds enwrap the pine-clad mountain pass. My page boy has yet to return from herb picking. Half drunk, I climb to where the pagoda overlooks the stream, cast in poetic mood, as often by mountain rain." And then the little 4-character inscription over here reads, "Drawn on an early autumn day under the influence of some wine." So here again, we have a brush pot that's imitating a tradition of writing poetry and painting landscape that belongs to an elite and scholarly lifestyle. Drunken afternoons gazing at the natural world, attended by servants, and also with an immediacy of artistic production. I drew this now, at this moment, while drunk on an early autumn day. But in fact, the all-important physical presence of the artist of this combined text and image is missing. Instead, this is a piece that through the many hands of the potters imitates elite content in a wholly new and transitional medium. So what I'm claiming is that these are the kinds of ceramics that Dutch consumers in the 17th century would have seen in large quantities. And we see them over and over again in still life paintings like this really beautiful example by Willem Kalf, and this slightly less beautiful, but still very helpful for my point, example by Van Streek. And although it's unlikely the Dutch would have been attuned to all these subtleties of elite aesthetics that I've been talking about, this kind of marriage of image and text, they understood that writing and imagery existed together on porcelain surfaces. And they reference it in their own ceramic production. So this is an example of what I'm going to call Delftware, what most people call Delftware. So this is earthenware, it's not porcelain, produced by Samuel van Eenhoorn's production company in the 17th century. And what I'm hoping that you'll notice in this detail is this section here, where we see that it's decorated with pseudo-Chinese script. So this isn't legible, it's not real Chinese, but it's making a reference to these models that are coming into the Netherlands from China. So my point is that Chinese porcelains presented Dutch consumers not simply with a new decorative style, fashionable for a moment and quickly discarded, but instead offered a model for how ceramic surfaces could carry an abundance of information, drawing on a variety of printed and painted materials. And I just want to add that in China, these kinds of ceramics circulated primarily, we think, among socially ambitious merchants. So it's giving them a kind of vehicle for accessing elite culture that used to exist only in these unitary originary forms, you know, a single painting that would be exchanged between friends. It probably wouldn't even be bought and sold on an open market, or not often. So it's giving these, these merchants access in some ways to this whole body of material from which they had been excluded. It's what some art historians have referred to as the bourgeoisification of Chinese taste, so the making more kind of common of what had been elite Chinese taste. And that body of material, once it's constructed in China, is then exported to the Netherlands. Okay, the second, within this idea of trade and objects coming from China into the Netherlands, the second body of material I want to look at are printed books. And what I want to give you an example of, a really concrete sort of evidence that Chinese printed books existed in the Netherlands in the 17th century, is this little example at Oxford. It's a late 16th century book that describes the 24 exemplary practitioners of filial piety. And it's inscribed in the flyleaf in Dutch and dated to 1603. So we're looking here at the inscription on the flyleaf on the other page, on the second page of the cover, on the left, and then in black and white, an interior illustration from the book on the right. This little inscription in Dutch tells us that Chinese is written and read from right to left and from top to bottom, and that this book came to the owner's hands accompanied by a small Chinese box, seashells, and 2 pieces of Chinese paper. And sadly, those objects are now missing, but we still have the book. So this is an example of a Chinese book in Dutch hands that I want to stand in for the many other Chinese books that were in Dutch and other European hands in the 17th century. We have really good records of these small personal libraries that were built in the 17th century. And for those who are interested in the world beyond Europe, would include objects such as a book like this one, and that are now in larger collections at Oxford. At Manchester University Library has a really wonderful collection of 17th century Chinese books that came into European hands in this period. But this is just going to stand in as one example of the proof. And then the other example I want to show you is it's not a Chinese book, it's a European book, but a European book that is showing us legible Chinese characters and what we think is the earliest example of a Chinese landscape being reproduced in a printed form in Europe. So what I'm showing here is the title page of a book that combines Matteo Ricci's account of China. So you remember we talked about him already, this famous Jesuit, and some other lesser known missionaries' accounts that are combined together in the book. The book itself is tiny. This is my hand and my fingers holding it open. And so when you read it, you don't at all have that experience of opening a big, vast book on a big table where you can really immerse yourself in it. Instead, you have to kind of they wouldn't let me pick it up, but you have to bring the book up to your face to be able to see it. It's not illustrated. Almost the entire book is text, except for this frontispiece. But the frontispiece is so amazing that it's what I want to talk to you about here. At the top, it has this little rondel with a figure that may be Confucius or Buddha, and then at the bottom, a map of China that shows us the major rivers, and also really pays a lot of attention to picturing the Great Wall. But what's most important for my purposes is to think about these 2 vertical text blocks on left and right of the title page. Because as we get closer, we can see that the Chinese characters are legible. And as I've tried to show already, this isn't something you can count on in the 17th century among European productions. Looking at that candlestick, you can see that that's totally pseudo-Chinese text. But this text is legible, and it forms the phrase for geese descending to level sand. Like the image of friends drinking wine by the red cliffs and remembering the battles that raged there and thinking about immortality, this simple phrase, geese descending to level sand, has a long history in China. The text and image together are one of the 8 views of the Xiaoxiang rivers, one of 8 subjects that formed a suite of texts and images that were first codified in the 10th and 11th centuries. So these are, in a sense, prompts for artists and poets to further amplify this idea of what this region in Hunan province can signify, not just in history, but as a place for quiet reflection. It doesn't mean you actually travel there. You travel there in your mind. So this image group is saturated with associations relating to escape from the strictures of court, nostalgia for past historical and personal moments, and a site that is on the margins. So it allows you to revive your spirit and to, in a sense, comment back on the center. Frida Merck has a really beautiful book about the 8 views. And one of her contentions is that there's also a political component to how these views are sometimes used, at least in the 10th and 11th centuries, that they can be a kind of subtle way of creating a political critique, so that you can either literally or sort of figuratively make yourself a recluse from court culture, make yourself a recluse from elite society, and then use that space as a way to critique what you have seen there. So this suite of images, this use of the idea of landscape, of the idea of geese descending, and the small poetic phrases, influence not only painting and poetry in China, but also in Japan and Korea. So I'm showing here a Korean scroll that's just one example of a Korean response to this poetic subject matter. And here, what I'm hoping you can see in this beautiful painting is, again, the geese descending to the sandy flats. And in the first 4 characters of the inscription, the title, right, the geese descending to sandy flats. So again, what we see on the left then is maybe the earliest representation of a Chinese landscape painting in a European text. And it gives us additional information that European viewers were absorbing all kinds of combinations of text and image from China, not just in porcelain, but also through, I'm going to argue, printed books. But where did the model for this frontispiece come from? Were the engraver and publisher of Matteo Ricci's account looking at a Chinese hand or hanging scroll? I'm going to say that this is unlikely. If we return to Athanasius Kircher, that German Jesuit I mentioned living in Rome and taking in all these letters from other Jesuits, this is an interior illustration of one of his book describing China. And you can see here that there's a landscape painting hanging in a way that none of us would want to do. This isn't good for the painting, but hanging over the edge of the table in his depiction of a woman in an interior. So this is an image of a Chinese landscape painting in a printed book, but we have no evidence that there were actual Chinese paintings of this type in European collections in the 17th century. And I'm hoping that this in some ways is going to be shocking to you. So in other words, I'm giving you ample evidence that there were literally millions of pieces of Chinese porcelain in the Netherlands in the 17th century. There were hundreds of examples of Chinese printed books in the Netherlands and other parts of Europe in the 17th century. But we have no extant examples of a Chinese landscape painting in the Dutch hands in the 17th century. And this maybe speaks again to this incommensurability, this inability of the Europeans to understand what was important in Chinese landscape paintings, in Chinese calligraphy, and why they were valued so highly. So instead of painting, what I think was the model for our little Regni Chinesis, our little book title page, was most likely a printed painting manual. And so I'm showing a woodcut from the 3rd volume of the Qing Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting. I understand that this is a later date than the book, that this book is a later date than that little Regni Chinesis, but there are earlier versions of these painting manuals that were in Dutch hands in the 17th century. And you can see, right, this is again geese descending to sandy flats, and you can see the same 4-character phrase here that we saw already in the Regni Chinesis printed book. And that was being, that suite of phrases about the Xiaoxiang rivers that was being circulated throughout East Asia, including in Korea. I'm not going to say much more about painting manuals here, except to say that this is another example of the bourgeoisification of Chinese taste. So these manuals, of course, are being produced first in China. They're primarily circulating in China, and they're not so much telling you how to paint as they're telling you how to look at painting. They're really more about connoisseurship. They're a really interesting body of material, and maybe I'll just leave that here and say that we can talk more about it in questions if you like. But again, this is what I see circulating out of China into the Netherlands rather than paintings themselves. It's printed books about painting. It's Chinese printed books about painting. Okay, in the concluding section of my talk tonight, I'd like to move from thinking about the kinds of objects and information that originated in China and circulated through East Asia, ending up in the Netherlands, and think instead about the Dutch response to these Chinese visual materials. So showing again the Samuel van Eenhoorn candlestick and its kind of wacky pseudo-Chinese text, what I want to think about is not just decoration on the surface, but the body itself, the material that they're imitating. So I'm just quickly going to say some things that I'm sure are well known to most of this audience, but just to remind us all. Porcelain is a particular kind of ceramic. It requires a particular kind of clay composition, and it can be fired at extremely high temperatures, which creates this kind of vitrification. The other thing that's important about porcelain is that it's translucent. So what I'm showing here is my own hand holding up a porcelain plate to the light. And what I'm hoping you can see is that my fingers, the shadow of my fingers, is shining through. In contrast, when we think about Dutch ceramics in the 17th century imitating Chinese porcelains, what we're thinking about is low temperature fired earthenware. And I'm showing you a picture of an object that I actually have here in my office. So this is a 17th century, this is a real 17th century ceramic. It's just a sherd, right? It's just a broken piece of it. But if we look at both the front of my porcelain plate at home and then the Dutch earthenware ceramic, one of the things I'm trying to explain is that the Dutch had to first paint the surface of the ceramic white in order to make it look like a porcelain ceramic body, and then paint it with blue tin glaze on top of that. And the reason, among many, that we know that is if you turn the plates over, you can see the earthenware body of the Delftware, of the Dutch ceramic, that's being covered up with this white slip. Whereas in my porcelain plate, this is actually Eastern European, it's Romanian, where my mother-in-law was from. You can, I don't know if you can see it in the image, but the unglazed rim of the plate here is as white as the glazed part of the plate. So the body of the ceramic is actually white. And even when we go back to the Delftware, you can see the earthenware peeking through here where the surface has been abraded. I'm not going to talk more about the industrial spy, the Jesuit missionary who became an industrial spy and gave Europeans the secret of how to make Chinese porcelain. I just want to take this last little section to think about the fact that although many art historians claim that Dutch potters were imitating exactly Chinese porcelain, that they were trying to copy exactly the decoration on Chinese porcelain. When I show you these two plates, the first thing I wanted to ask you was which one do you think is the Chinese and which one do you think is the Dutch? And then I wanted to kind of point us to the ways, I'll let you just sit with that for a moment, which one is the Chinese and which one is the Dutch? So the answer is that the Chinese example is on the left and the Dutch is on the right. And again, this is porcelain and this is earthenware. This is what's, again, we're calling Delftware. And among many other issues, I just want to point out the fact that the Europeans are not actually able to, or not seeming to want to, copy some of the conventions of picturing that I was talking about earlier in terms of the relationship between European prints and Chinese or Japanese prints. So in the Chinese example, we're still sort of looking up, the space is pushed up the plate and it's layered so that we don't really get a cavity of space to move into, which is conventional in Chinese picturing. In the European example, the artist is aiming to place some rocks in the foreground so that we do, I think the effort is to make us seem as if we're going to move back into space on the surface of the plate, even in an artwork that's supposed to be this perfect kind of imitation or fool the eye of the Dutch consumer into thinking that what they're buying is not Dutch, but is actually Chinese. Maybe what I'm pointing out can be made a little bit more clear here. Right, so again, that sense of space moving up the surface of the plate in the Chinese example and moving into surface in the Dutch. But the Dutch don't just imitate Chinese artwork, and they definitely push Delftware into new design possibilities in terms of this flower pyramid, where very expensive cut flowers would be placed one by one into these little cavities. So this is to create this kind of flower pyramid and to conjoin porcelain with expensive blooms. And although the bottom of this image does have some reference to Chinese images, obviously, There are other parts of it that seem to be wholly imitating European forms that exist around them. So this is a weird kind of hybrid object. And I say all of that because I want to kind of push us to my concluding image, which is from the very end of the 19th century. And because I'm mindful of time, I'm just going to say this very quickly. What we have here is an attempt to take a company that had existed in the 17th century, the Porcelain. It was purchased by Joost Toft, and he wanted to reinvigorate Delftware and to kind of bring it into the contemporary moment. But he claims to do that by looking back at ancient forms. And yet the kinds of produce that they are creating are neither Asian, obviously Asian, nor even obviously 17th century Dutch in terms of the body. So the actual body of this material is much more like stoneware that was being produced in England at this time. So it's not actually Chinese porcelain, which they could have made by then. And it's not actually earthenware or Delftware. It's this new kind of ceramic, and they're not even painting on it the kinds of images that would have been painted in the 17th century Netherlands or 17th century China. Instead, it's an imitation of a painting by a 17th century Dutch Baroque artist. So because I'm hurrying, I'm not sure I'm being quite as clear about that point as I wanted to be. Maybe we can come back to it in questions. Let me just conclude by saying this. The tile picture of a painting by Frans Hals was again made around 1900. And I just want to remind you that that was only 10 years after Mary Cassatt saw the exhibition of Japanese woodblock prints in Paris. As I tried to suggest, her work, like Mark Tobey's and like Joost Toft's, owes a debt to East Asian art. But the degree to which these debts are acknowledged and the degree to which the artists are open to a new way of seeing is vastly different, I hope I've shown, and tells us much about how we can think of history, modernity, and cross-cultural artistic exchange. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odell, for that wonderful presentation. We're going to move into our Q&A session here. And just as a reminder, if you can, please use the Q&A box. That's that little icon at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to put in some questions. If you can't figure that out, you're welcome to use the chat, but we're trying to get everything in the Q&A so it's easier for us to find out or to see. Let me see what we're doing here. All right, I'm going to give the audience a moment to get some questions in and see if they've got anything. Jeff Kinkley, thank you. He says, a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
But I'm also, we've got another audience member, Ray Craig, also saying wonderful lecture, and she hopes you return.
Thank you. Of course, it's my pleasure. It's always it's such a nice opportunity to just, things that I think about all the time but don't really have a chance to share with others, especially in this year when I'm on sabbatical and trying to write a book. It's so nice to have a chance to see if any of this seems reasonable, if I'm making arguments clearly, if all of this is, things you knew already, and, whether it's helping you think differently about exchange between Europe and China. Could you tell the difference between the Chinese and the Dutch plate? Did you know which was which?
That is a good question. Dawn, just to let you know, I'm going to pull the slide off of the screen.
Okay.
So we can see you. And all right, we do have a couple questions rolling in. Our first question from Jeff Kinkley is, are art historians in China interested in these cross-cultural questions?
Oh, what a great question. I love it. They didn't used to be, or at least I wasn't aware of the interest. And when I was writing my dissertation now, many years ago, I felt like I was relatively isolated. Now it's this wonderful community, wonderful, super supportive community. And one of the things that's maybe one of the few positive things for me during COVID and the shutdown is that we've had this group that we were meeting every week during the summer, and now we're meeting every other week. But it includes art historians in Singapore and Beijing and Amsterdam and Rome, and I mean, I don't need to name all the cities, basically worldwide art historians who are interested in this kind of cross-cultural material. And it began as a relatively small group. Now we're something like 60 or 70. And so, yeah, I think there is growing interest. And some of the best work, of course, is being done by art historians in Taiwan and China. I'm really looking to them for inspiration these days.
That's lovely. We've got another question. Let's see. Dennis Lee asks, did the Dutch ever try to reproduce or develop porcelain?
Yes. So there was a Jesuit missionary who, I think I used this term, it's really accurate, was a kind of industrial spy. He went to the Chinese ceramic producing center, one of the largest, Jingdezhen, and took notes basically on what he observed there, and was able to finally get the proper recipe to make the clay that allows for porcelain. I think that the Europeans at that point were already aware of the high firing temperatures that were required. Even the Medici, I think in the 16th century, had made some efforts to try to replicate porcelain. But yeah, so he was able to send this material back. I have the exact date, I could look it up, it's in my talk, but in the beginning of the 18th century, he was able to send this material back, information back. And so it was Augustus the Strong's court who first produced a true porcelain. There are stonewares that are more like porcelain than the Delftwares that I was showing. The other thing I'll maybe just mention is that the Europeans had kind of two ways of thinking about porcelain. One was that they really thought of it as almost a magical material. And again, it was because it has this wonderful translucence, it sort of reflects and almost seems to emanate light. There were stories that porcelain was made of human bones ground up, or that you had to bury it in the earth for decades. So that's one kind of way of thinking about porcelain. And the other then was much more prosaic and almost domesticated. And they kind of think of it as being like a sequence of moves that you might, that's almost like something you would do in a kitchen. So there is the kind of thinking of porcelain as magical, paying vast amounts of money for the best examples. And then another side of it that really is more about bringing it into the home, thinking about it as a utility, something that helps in domestic environments. And in both cases, they're also often kind of coding it as being feminine. It's women who have this taste for porcelain. And it also even gets sexualized, so that there are jokes about someone's china being a reference to being sexually active outside of your marriage, which is weird, but true.
Thank you for that explanation. We've got a whole bunch of questions that have rolled in, so this is great. The next one we've got is from Megan Essler, and she asks, can you say any more about the Jesuit priest who was the industrial spy and brought some of the secrets of porcelain production to the West?
His last name was D'Entrecoll, and I can recommend, actually it would take me a moment to find it, but the author's name, but I can recommend a book called The Arcaneum that really goes through the whole story, which reads like a novel because it is so amazing of his secretly acquiring this recipe. I mean, the Chinese were, of course, if I didn't make this clear in the talk, in the 17th century, the Chinese were in control of their mercantilism, in the sense that they, the 17th century is broken by the the wars, right, that lead to the destruction of the Ming and the instantiation of the Qing. But they were by and large in control of their port cities. They were relegating merchants to European merchants and other merchants to living only in certain parts of China. You couldn't freely travel throughout the countryside. They did allow missionaries more leeway, and that's maybe the reason that it was a missionary who was able to find this recipe and to be able to get this information back to Europe. But the Chinese were not interested in buying very much from European merchants. They were interested in sending material out into the rest of the world, and they really wanted to control that commerce.
Thank you. Our next question actually alludes to part of your answer there, and it's from Ray Craig. Are there records of how the Chinese regarded European painting?
Yes. So I think the best records we have are from the court, although I was just listening, I was talking about that group where we have art historians and curators and gallery owners from around the world coming together every other week to talk about this kind of material. This wonderful new source that gives us a better sense of how the Chinese might have been thinking about, this is a different kind of painting, but reverse painting under glass, which was a really big part of the export trade in the 18th century. And they're talking about this kind of painting, which was sometimes done by Europeans, but also was done by Chinese artists serving European tastes. The Chinese authors are talking about it as being bizarre and exotic. So those are the same kinds of terms that are used by Europeans thinking about Chinese painting. So in other words, it's a good example where both, I guess we could say, populations are looking askew at what each other side thinks is their primary form of representation. So European oil painting is met with far less enthusiasm in China than the Europeans expected it to be. And where we have better records about that is in the court, especially in the Qing dynasty court, where European artists, European missionaries were employed as court artists. And this, for an artist like Castiglione, who was an Italian Jesuit missionary working in the Chinese court in the 18th century, he wanted to be converting, what he envisioned as souls to Christianity, but the emperor really wanted him to be painting works, sometimes Buddhist works, or works, using Buddhist iconography in order to serve his interests. And what the Chinese court liked about European painters was their ability to capture faces in paintings when portraiture was needed, when accuracy of that kind was needed. So an ability to kind of, what we were talking about earlier, shade the face or build up a lot of detail. I wish I had thought to include some Castiglione images in this PowerPoint, because I think you would be able to see exactly what I'm talking about. But how to put this, it was like in service to the court. So again, this wasn't transforming Chinese picture making. It wasn't transforming Chinese ink painting for sure. They were aware of it. They understood that some of the technological systems behind it and using one-point linear perspective was interesting to members of the Chinese court. But I guess it's maybe operating more on the level of kind of science than it is on the level of a kind of expressive, historically embedded form of picture making. All of these are great questions. Thank you so much.
We've got a couple other questions that are very related to the last two, but I still want to ask them just in case there's other pieces you'd like to add. Dorothy Payton asks, what was happening during this time in the other direction? In what ways did European artist expression filter into Chinese painting practices at the court? And then the other question is another audience member, Suzanne, asks, were any of the Chinese elite in the 17th century aware of any European art? Which I know you've answered already, but if you want to add anything else.
Definitely. So I should probably, maybe it wasn't clear that it wasn't that I wasn't clear, I didn't say it. European missionaries did bring oil paintings to China. So they don't travel as well. This was a many month long journey. Canvas doesn't travel as well in this kind of super wet environment of the ship. But they did bring oil paintings to China, and they had oil paintings, or they themselves made oil paintings while they were there. And then, as I think I did mention this, they sent back these stories for European readers about, oh, this convert saw this painting of the Virgin Mary, and it was partly like the Virgin Mary's presence that was being evoked in the eyes of the missionary, but it was also the way that it was painted that overpowered the potential Chinese convert with its realism. But we don't have evidence that the Chinese themselves were writing about European painting in this way. I'm being kind of reductive here when I say this, but I think in some ways, maybe European painting would have been seen as vulgar and professional, that it was aiming at, again, if I'm going to follow this idea of a kind of an elite taste that has to do with the model of a scholarly community, with painting as a part of gift-giving practices rather than as a way to make money, that all of that is existing right in this realm over here. And the kinds of paintings that Europeans were doing might have been seen to be more like the sorts of professional paintings that you might commission, that a temple might commission from a Chinese artist of, a set of deities or narrative kinds of images. And so it's not to say they couldn't take from those images and that they didn't find them odd and exotic and intriguing, but I don't think it was filtering up to have much of an influence in this idea of elite picture making. But I also want to be clear that that whole elite world is really permeable. It's not nearly so kind of constricted and permanent as people used to write about it being. Some of those paintings do get sold. Some people are working for money. If you couldn't make your way in the bureaucracy, you might have to earn your living by being an artist, even if you'd been trained to be a scholar. And then we do have these interesting examples of kind of eccentric painters in the 17th and 18th centuries who do seem to be taking some of these ideas of shadowing and incorporating it into ink painting. So taking ideas of shadow from European painting and incorporating into ink painting. And then the court is definitely deeply engaged with European painting, at least by the 18th century. But again, I'm thinking more in terms of when illusionism is necessary, when you need a certain kind of accuracy that may not be seen as being part of fine art, but may be seen as part of almost scientific illustration.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a little bit different question. We have quite a few questions that are larger thematic ones, but I'm going to take a specific one right now. Sawako asks, could you compare, again, the two plates, the Chinese versus Dutch, regarding the latter being the two-dimensional versus three-dimensional? If you could, review that again. It was hard to see all the details on Zoom.
Yeah. So one of the things I was trying to do with that plate comparison, thank you so much for this question, because I didn't think I did it very well in this talk, but one of the things I was aiming to do was to really speak back against a tradition of writing about Delftware as if it's simply, again, imitating Chinese porcelain. And when I actually tried to concretely say, okay, here are all these hundreds of pieces of Chinese porcelain that we know were in the Netherlands, like specific examples that we know were in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Here's all of these hundreds of pieces of Delftware. And I can't ever find, no one, as far as I know, has ever been able to find like an exact one-to-one match. And so that says to me that the Dutch painters, Dutch ceramic artists, they don't have that Chinese porcelain vessel in front of them and they're trying to duplicate it. They're thinking like, well, I want something that's like vaguely Chinese. And then they're doing their own designs or drawings. And in addition, they're soon going to be innovating their own kinds of forms. So they're not just going to be working with deep basins or teacups or kinds of materials that were already circulating in China. They're going to create things like the flower pyramid. And so I think that what I was trying to do with that comparison is to say that seems to me a very typical Chinese example of where you want to emphasize the two-dimensional. You don't want to create a grid and a one-point linear perspective movement into space. That's like a Renaissance European concern that is not the same concern of these Chinese artists. But I feel with the Dutch potters, because they're kind of vaguely thinking Chinese, but they're not copying something directly, they can't help but try to impose a sort of like three-dimensional view into space, so that there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background that goes this way, deep, rather than up the surface of the picture. But I don't know if that was clear enough in that particular comparison.
I think that works just fine. Another question is from Jin Tan. Great presentation, Professor. Do you have any examples of early exported Chinese textiles in 17th century and what pattern they normally have?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I don't have a good answer for you. I know other people are working on it. And the other thing I didn't do much with, and I wish I had, was to think about lacquer, because that also is coming. It's not in the vast quantities that we see with ceramic, but that also is coming into the Netherlands. In terms of, I mean, lacquer, when it's perfectly made, will be pretty impermeable. It can last a long time. But I think the textiles were maybe similar to paintings on canvas. They didn't do as well in these long journeys, but we do have examples of them. I'm going to admit my ignorance in terms of being able to give you several exact examples from the 17th century, but I'll tell you that by the 18th century, when they could, they were really interested in things like court robes. And there are certainly examples of individual patches, that would have indicated rank, and trying to codify those, like how to read clothing in order to understand China better through clothing. When the Jesuits first went to China, they thought that the best way to introduce themselves to their potential converts was to dress as monks, as Buddhist monks. And then they realized that that wasn't where they wanted to be in the social hierarchy. And so then they began to dress themselves as Chinese scholars. And so that's an example where clothing it's not only about the beauty of the fabrics. I think that's definitely a part of what Europeans are wanting to collect and wanting to imitate. But it's also thinking about clothing as being a way of understanding the culture, and that if you don't get it right, you're going to be misunderstood when you put yourself into that world.
Great. We've got quite a few more questions in there. This one also kind of links to that comparison between the missionaries versus, the scholars or the court clothing, just that comparison between the two. Adlanen asks, you mentioned two channels, missionaries and commerce. Which of these do you see as being more instrumental in exchanging culture and arts?
I would love to throw that. I wish I could see you all, because I'd love to throw that question back to you. There was a Chinese rights controversy, by which I mean the Jesuits, the church in Rome felt that the Jesuits were being too lenient in what they would accept as appropriate behavior on the part of Chinese that they had converted. So the Jesuits were in China, were making an effort to think about ways that they could incorporate ancestor reverence into a Christian practice, among other issues. And the church in Rome felt that they'd gone too far, and eventually they pulled all of those missionaries back in the 18th century. And so I started answering your question by mentioning that, because I think one of the things that happens is that trade comes to dominate how Europeans are getting information from China. So maybe in the 16th and 17th centuries, we want to think about the missionaries as being the most important vehicle for Europeans to know something about the Asian culture. But by the later 17th and 18th centuries, I feel as if trade and actually imperialism are going to become more important vehicles. And I'm wondering if, I would again love to know your ideas. I'm wondering if merchants ask different kinds of questions from the questions that missionaries ask. Because just the fact that there can be what's called like a pidgin language that would be spoken in port cities that would give people, and many different multilingual communities, it would allow them to communicate with each other, because you didn't need that many words to be able to make this kind of mercantile exchange. But as I've been trying to say with Matteo Ricci, like he really read, understood, could communicate in Chinese to a high level. There's a whole body of historians and students of literature in China who is working on the texts that came out of these missions. It's because they're dense and they're really interesting and they require a deep knowledge of Chinese. I don't think that missionaries need to have that same kind of degree of intimacy with the culture if they're living in these port cities. There are other kinds of intimacies that go on. I'm just thinking about the ways families were constructed in these port cities and the beginning of, issues of race, which is really not even in the minds, in the way that we think of it today. It's not even in the minds of the 17th century individuals. That's something that gets constructed in the 18th century. And I feel that that also is maybe tied to mercantilism. I'm sorry, I'm not being very concise, but I guess I would say that, yeah, it depends on the period you're looking at. And it also maybe depends on the questions that you want to ask.
Excuse me, we are getting close to our time. We do have a few more minutes for a couple more questions, so I'm going to try to squeeze them in. For the questions that we don't get to, if you're able to join us at the tea house, that would be a great place to follow up there. We'll also try to speak with Don, and if you have a question, you want to email us, we'll make sure Dawn gets that, and we'll send you forward on that reply as well.
And please feel free to email me directly too. I'm very happy, I'm delighted actually to get any kind of feedback and pushback, things you didn't agree with. I'd love to hear about it.
Great, thank you. We'll be sure anyone who wants to reach out for Saturday, we'll pass on Dawn's email. Thank you. But to our last, hopefully, couple questions. We have an anonymous one. The acknowledgement of the debt to Chinese sources is clearly different. Is that perhaps motivated by the Dutch adaptation for local consumer tastes versus the more creative exploration of the later artists you referenced? The European objects were produced for very different reasons, it seems.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I would say too that in a sense, what a company like De Porcelain Place is selling at the end of the 19th century is a Dutch taste that's actually being consumed in large part by Americans. So forgive me if I said this already, but that tile picture of a painting by Frans Hals would have been the kind of thing that would have been an ocean liner decoration, and those are the sorts of ships that would have been dedicated to bringing Americans to the old world in a period in which they were really interested in rediscovering their European heritage and uniting America with the kind of proto-democracy they saw at work in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. And so I think at that point, you're right, like the Chineseness leaches out of it entirely. What I imagine Americans in the 19th century and early 20th century were thinking when they looked at that kind of Delftware was about Holland. They weren't really thinking about the role of Asia in allowing Delftware in innovating Delftware. So, and there's also something, I mean, this is not my field of study, but I feel that there's also something about the 20th century in terms of abstraction that has to do with a more self-conscious attempt on the part of some, I'm thinking particularly of some Zen Buddhist monks, so Japanese monks or Japanese intellectuals who are dedicated to the study of Buddhism, sort of bringing that to America or bringing it to New York, and almost deliberately trying to educate Americans about Buddhism, and so it's not that that's not equally interesting, and again, it's not about better or worse, but it's just a different sort of interaction because there's a more self-conscious attempt to do what the Jesuits were aiming to do in China, right? A self-conscious attempt to educate Americans and convert maybe Americans to Buddhism.
Okay. I'm going to squeeze in one more question.
Okay.
Jones Kelly asks, can you tell us more about the topic of your book?
Oh, Jones, thank you. That's so nice of you to ask. I'm working on an 18th century Dutch American. So this is a man who was born in the Netherlands, lived almost 20 years in various parts of Asia, but especially in the trade cities of Canton and Macau. and then moved to Philadelphia, where he displayed his enormous collection of Chinese art. It's such a great story for a couple of reasons. The collection went missing. He lost all of his money. He came back with his fortune, supposedly, built this estate outside of Philadelphia called China's Retreat, displayed this collection. He was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson. He was a member of some of the same societies as Jefferson, and had written, there's a letter exchange between him and Benjamin Franklin, so he's sort of part of that world. Loses all his money, sells the art collection at Christie's auction house in London in 1800, and dies shortly after. And it was just thought the collection had been dispersed and was missing, and now we're recovering parts of it. And so that's a part of what I'm writing about. But the other part of it is that in between trips to China and at the end of his life moving to Philadelphia, he also lived in South Carolina, where he was a rice plantation owner and a slave owner. And the account that he wrote about his trip to Beijing, because this collector, his name is Van Braam Houckgeest, was the part of the Dutch East India Company last embassy to the Beijing court. And he wrote a book about that experience, and he published it with a French immigrant who had grown up in Saint Domingo. And that French immigrant, whose name is Moreau de Saint-Marie, was one of the first people to write about race in terms of skin color. So he's really trying to create this pseudoscience of race. And they collaborate then on writing about China. So there's a lot to talk about, right? There's the collection as we're reconstructing it. There's thinking about the artists that Van Braam Houckgeest hired in Canton to do a particular kind of painting and trying to reconstruct their lives. There's Van Braam's first wife, his wife's niece with whom he had a sexual affair and children, the Malaysian housekeeper who he also brought to Philadelphia, the 5 Chinese men who traveled with him from China and may be among the earliest Asian Americans on the East Coast of the United States in its very earliest years. So there's a lot going on, and I've been really struggling to know, what people need to know before I can go on to the next part of the story. But I've been working hard on it, and I hope to finish it this year so that they will be done and I can start looking for a publisher.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We are at the end of our Q&A. Again, if anyone has any other questions, I know we didn't get to all of those great questions in our Q&A box. Please join us for the tea house that will be coming up shortly after this talk. Dr. Odell, thank you again so much for speaking with us.
Of course, it's my
yeah. I wanted just to give you, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to add before we close out our session.
No, and again, it was just really my pleasure. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to talking with some of you in the tea house if that's possible. And others, please do reach out by email. I'm really eager for feedback and questions, and especially for things that you think didn't work or didn't make sense or you're not convinced by.
Thank you so much again. I'm going to put up a slide really quickly here. Again, everyone, thank you so much for coming to our talk with Dr. Odell today. Just a quick reminder, our next month's presentation is The Scholars Retreat, Loss and Resilience in the Chinese Landscape and Garden with Ann Weatherall. And then again, just a reminder, our tea house will be coming up just after this. So you'll have to close out of the webinar and then come back in to the other link that is in your registration confirmation or your reminder emails. And of course, if you have any questions or you're having difficulties getting in, feel free to email me. We